This video is about lipids, one of our major biomacromolecules. Lipids are going to be made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So of our NCHOPs that make up the majority of our macromolecules, these are made up by that CH and O, which happens to be the exact same as carbohydrates. However, unlike carbohydrates, lipids do not have that set ratio. Remember, carbohydrates came in that 1 carbon to 2 hydrogen to 1 oxygen ratio. Lipids don't have that set ratio. However, they do have increased numbers of carbon atoms and increased numbers of hydrogen atoms with decreased number of oxygen atoms. So in this example here, you can see we have lots of carbon, lots of hydrogen, and very little oxygen atoms. And so if you were to see two molecules side by side, so if we were to compare that one, of course, to glucose, C6H12O6, and I said, okay, which one is a lipid and which one is a carb, you should know that the carb has that sort of set ratio and the lipids do not, and it has lots and lots of carbons and hydrogens in comparison to the oxygens. So lipids are water insoluble. So soluble means that it can dissolve, but then in is saying it cannot. That's the sort of the negative prefix there. So it is not soluble in water, which means that these molecules are hydrophobic, water-fearing. And if you need to review hydrophobia, you can go back to the second water properties video. So hydrophobic water molecules are water-fearing, and therefore are not soluble in water. And these lipids are also important for energy storage. Lipids contain twice the amount of energy as a typical polysaccharide, so lots and lots of energy in lipids. Fats are going to be a good example of lipids, and they are made of molecules of glycerol and fatty acids. So this picture shows that many birds will coat their wings with a lipidy coating, okay, made of fatty acids. And so when birds' wings get wet, that wetness does not actually seep into the feathers and soak it like, for example, your clothes might get soaked. The water will actually bead up on the surface, and so the bird can easily shake it off. That's why you can see birds like ducks, for example, going into the water, sitting on the water surface, dipping themselves into the water, and then they can just fly off of the water straight from the surface. They're not wet and soaked, and that's because this lipid coating on their feathers allows them to not be affected as much by the water. This is a typical picture of a lipid, okay? And you should note that the glycerol and the fatty acid do combine just like many other molecules do via dehydration synthesis. So that's a common theme there. If you want some more on that, you can go back to the dehydration synthesis video. There are going to be two main types of fatty acids. There's saturated fatty acids, and if you think of that word saturated, there's like a lot of something. And in saturated fatty acids, these carbon chains have only single bonds and they form straight lines. So these over here on the right are saturated fatty acids, and what that saturation is referring to is that means that there are the maximum number of hydrogens per carbon that can exist. And if you'd like more on that, you can come and see me. But for a basic level, these carbons have single bonds only and form straight lines. They do zigzag back and forth, but their overall path is straight. Saturated fatty acids can be jam-packed into tight spaces because they are single lines. And therefore, fats that we think of when we think of food that are made mostly of saturated fatty acids are solid at room temperature like butter. And if you were to go into probably your refrigerator or to the grocery store and look at butter, you can look at the nutritional facts there and see that it'll mostly be made of saturated fatty acids. The other type of fatty acids that we'll talk about are unsaturated fatty acids. These carbon chains have at least one double bond between the carbons, and that creates what we call a kink in the fatty acid. So it'll be single bond, single bond, single bonds, double bond, and then single bonds this way. And it ends up changing the angle at which the molecules propagate down the length of the fatty acid. And so you have this kink where that double bond exists. And so because of this kink, unsaturated fatty acids cannot be jam-packed into tight spaces. Therefore, unsaturated fatty acids will be liquid at room temperature. So if you think oils as fats, those will be made of unsaturated fatty acids. All right, and so after this video, you should be able to answer these questions. And if you can't, please feel free to go back and watch this again.